So we're here today to talk about how to accelerate EV adoption with a special focus on EV infrastructure. I'm Zachary, CEO of CleanTechnica. Hopefully you know me. This is one of our favorite things to do is get a handful of experts on to talk about a core, critical, important topic and to dive into the details of it. So today, some of the people on here, aside from me, are Ben de Alba from the California Energy Commission, Cory Bullis from Flow, and Peter O'Connor from Plug in America. And just as a brief intro to myself before I let the others introduce themselves a little bit, I've been covering this industry for about a decade. I've previously co-hosted or hosted EV charging conferences in Europe and the UAE. And we've talked at length to EV charging players, I think all of them at some point or another, about what is needed in this space. But the market is quickly changing, quickly evolving, quickly growing, and there's always more to learn. And preparing for this webinar today, talking with Cory, Ben, and Peter, they have a lot of great insights, a lot of great input and information to share. And I think it's going to be a fun and fruitful conversation about how to accelerate EV adoption, especially in the EV charging market. To start off, Cory, can you introduce yourself?
Happy to. Thanks, Zach. And maybe I can make a quick introduction of Flow as a company first. And we're an EV charging company for those who aren't familiar with us, and we're headquartered out of Quebec City. And we certainly like to boast that we're one of the largest charging providers in North America in terms of scale of deployment. I personally cover policy for the US nationally and along the West Coast.
And we'll move on to Pete.
Pete O'Connor with Plug in America. I'm a senior policy manager focusing on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and I also cover some federal policy. I've been working in the EV field for a number of years. Plug in America represents the EV drivers, and we were founded by activists who were trying to save the EV1 back in the day. And around that time, I was doing some research on a book called The Hype About Hydrogen, and looking at the alternatives to hydrogen vehicles, including the nascent EVs back then.
Was that a book with Joe Rohn? Or
yes, I did some of the research on battery chapters for him, and the hydrogen folks, when they find out about that, are never too thrilled.
Yeah, that's a throwback. Very, very cool. Good stuff. And Ben de Alba.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Really happy to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Cory and Peter and yourself, Zach. I'm Ben de Alba. I'm an advisor to Commissioner Patty Monahan at the California Energy Commission. We focus on EV infrastructure deployments. We're the leads for the state of California with that regard. For both light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles, California is leading the charge in a lot of aspects for ZEVs. We've got about an 8% population last year, at least, we had 8% of all new passenger vehicles for ZEVs, and we've got about 70,000 chargers deployed in the state already. So really happy to share my experiences and what I can contribute to this conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, maybe you should tell people, explain where California is on the map. No. Yeah, obviously a lot of perspective coming out of California, so we'll try to make use of that, tap that. So we'll roll into the questions. We have our own that I'm eager to ask and get answers to. If any participants would like to ask questions, we just ask that you try to use the Q&A feature. It's much easier for that process. There's also a chat feature on the side, sort of if you need to get into other conversations, but focus on Q&A for the Q&A section. And after these, we'll roll into that at the end. So the first question, going out to all of you, what do you see currently as the most critical policies needed in the EV charging space to accelerate EV adoption? The most critical policies. And we'll start with Pete.
All right. Well, there's different levels you can look at. There's the federal policy state, and local. And we have policy priorities on all of these, but let's start with federal because that can have the largest impact when enacted. Covers the most area, obviously. So we would like to see a federal investment program focusing on establishing a cohesive network. There is often a business case for individual stations, but a network is more than simply the individual stations. It needs to have coverage, even in areas that are less heavily traveled. People buy an EV because they want, if they think they can go anywhere, not just where they go every day, but they want to go to the road trips. So a federal investment program could really help establish that. We'd like to see support for EV chargers on interstate rest areas. Currently, there's some federal policy limiting that. And we'd like to see consumer protection provisions for publicly funded stations, such that anything put in with public money is openly accessible by all EV drivers, has clear pricing transparency, has good uptime and reliability, and a number of other measures. And we'd like to see increased federal funding for rural EV charging and for EV charging in overburdened communities. Let's just start.
Thank you. We'll move over to Cory. Cory, what's your opinion on the most critical policies needed to accelerate EV adoption in the US?
Well, there's certainly no silver bullet, and there's quite a few I could list. But out of the interest of time, I think two of the most critical policies, and it's not meant to be the only ones, I would say first things first is really getting the utility piece right. Utilities will continue to have a critical role in the road to electrification because they can bring such immense resources to bear, not only to deploy stations, but to upgrade distribution grids and prepare for EV load growth. And of course, we also know they have an integral role with rate design. So that would be one critical piece, is really defining and shaping all of that. And then secondly, is the continued flow of incentives to both EVs and to charging stations. I mean, the reality is the industry writ large is still working on bringing overall costs down and becoming cost competitive with oil and gas. And so there's no greater commitment from governments of all levels, local, state, federal, to help move this market by giving consumers incentives for making a choice that is good for the environment when it comes to EVs. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. And I'll just, I said the US, and someone wants to clarify if we're also talking about Canadian policies. So I think it's fair to say we're covering beyond the US, but sometimes might be more specific about US policies, more focused on the US. And Ben, what do you have to say? What do you have to say for yourself, young man?
Well, I won't weigh in on the Canadian policy, but I will just perhaps offer some observations that maybe could benefit those in Canada. But we try to address the 3 C's in California, at least, and cost, convenience, and consumer awareness. And I think if a federal policy could get to those 3, I think we'll be in good shape. We want, of course, lower the cost of EVs and charging infrastructure, and that really means getting to scale. So policies that help us scale up would be great. Convenience, of course, supporting like ubiquitous charging. We want to make sure there's chargers everywhere so people feel comfortable charging up their EVs. So a policy that would ensure that we are equitably distributing chargers across the nation would be welcome. And of course, consumer awareness. And I think we're getting there. Tesla has done a lot of great work in California to make EVs acceptable and the norm. And now we have GM and Ford and other major manufacturers that are coming on board to help promote consumer awareness. And of course, GM's latest commercial with Will Ferrell, I think, helps a lot. But anything that would support those 3 C's, I think, would be a great start.
Zach, can I just amend my comment a little bit?
Yes, of course.
I had focused on the charging infrastructure, but obviously Plug in America recognized the federal tax credit for EVs as really essential in driving that learning curve and bringing costs down. And that's been really amazing to watch the effect of that over the past few years, bringing those costs down through economies of scale. So we really support extending the federal tax credit for more vehicles per manufacturer.
Thank you all. So another question topic, it's sort of where we see a more mature EV market. So in case people are not familiar, there's something called a charging pyramid that basically shows, where much of the charging is done is on the base of the pyramid. So home and workplace charging takes up a big chunk of the base of the pyramid. And then typically, somewhere in the middle is common destination charging, like grocery stores, restaurants. And then at the top of the pyramid is less frequently needed, very fast charging on road trips, for example. So I'm just curious to hear you guys talk about what is the goal? Where do you see a mature EV market in 2025 and beyond? How do you see the charging pyramid changing from where it is today to then? Because that, what we see as ideal in that regard should also shape policy to some extent. So we'll start with, we'll go in reverse this time. Start with Ben.
Well, a market in 2050, obviously we're on track to have a large portion of the vehicle population being ZEVs. Most of this charging, I think, is still going to take place in the garage at home. Folks are going to be reliant on their charger in their garage, and if you're living in a multi-unit dwelling, you're probably going to have to charge your car elsewhere. But I do agree that, look, we're going to need, again, it just goes back to the ubiquitous charging. You want to make sure if you go anywhere, there's going to be a charger available for you to charge your vehicle. We're seeing reports that even though we're going to be reliant heavily on, by 2040, 2050 is probably going to be very similar, but the majority of the charging is going to be done on level 2. But the biggest draw on the grid will be coming from those fast chargers, DC fast chargers and so forth. And even though they're going to make up a smaller portion of the number of chargers. So I think when we get to a high population of ZEVs, we're still going to be seeing a lot of folks charging in the garage. It might come into the form, maybe if you go downtown, you're parallel parking, you might be able to charge your car on the side of the street. We're looking at some of those type of chargers, demonstrations in California. So it remains to be seen, but again, I think level 2, maybe some level 1 is going to be dominant come 2050 with maybe TNCs and other corridor trip type folks charging on DC fast chargers.
Thanks. Cory, do you want to say a bit about how you see that evolving from now to 2025, 2030?
I would have to start off by saying my answer is probably not going to differ much from Ben's. Kind of stole the words out of my mouth there. I largely agree with what he's laying out, because at 50% EV adoption, we still have to build out a wide base or a wide foundation of allowing charging at home. And this is all under the assumption that as long as consumers still prefer to own their vehicles as the primary way of using a vehicle, then that's going to continue to be critical. So building that breadth at the foundation of the pyramid is still very relevant in my mind, followed by workplace charging and charging at schools. Where are consumers on a daily or weekly basis? And, I think related to that is, or maybe kind of a nuance embedded in that, is this idea that we're going to need lower cost charging options like what level 2 can provide. At 50% EV adoption is extremely high. And if you think about that amount of energy or that amount of load on the grid, and if it's all coming from fast charging, let's say, that's going to be very expensive for consumers potentially, depending on what time of day you're charging at. And that can also be a huge load on the grid. So I think we still need to we need to further build out that foundation of home charging and workplace charging, and still put kind of public fast charging at the higher end of the pyramid.
Yeah, I'll just give Pete in a moment, but just say, I laid out 7 things that I think are most critical accelerating EV adoption by 2030 in an article this week. And I have two on there for charging. One is more charging stations at multi-unit dwellings, MUDs or MUDs, which we'll come back to, and installing more charging stations at grocery stores, restaurants, and big box stores, because I do see those as two huge core gaps in the charging infrastructure at the moment. So sort of need to be developed more to build up the charging pyramid as would be ideal. But Pete, jump in with yours, and then we'll move on to a third question.
Sure. We have a question in the chat about repeating the details of the EV charging pyramid. If you could just lay that out again. I don't know if you can share a graphic or just
Yeah, we don't have just that the base is seen as, the bulk of charging should be theoretically done at home and workplaces. And it is today. In fact, it is to a very large degree because there's less public infrastructure than is probably needed. The middle is, where you would charge at places you routinely go, weekly, for example, like grocery store, the gym, certain restaurants, perhaps, or coffee shops. And then the smallest percentage of overall EV charging is done on road trips and fast chargers. But again, there may be more reliance on that than the middle portion right now because of a sort of a limited EV charging at that middle period of the pyramid. So sort of just seeing what needs to be filled out more to match the ideal pyramid. Pete, what do you think?
I think in the near term, we'll continue to see EV adoption predominant in those who can most easily do the uptake. So they're the ones buying EVs while they cost more and bringing those costs down for everyone else. So that'd be people who have single-family homes who can most easily do the charging. And so by 2025, 2030, it'll still be biased that way, but coming more into equilibrium. And there'd be greater representation among what we call garage orphans, people who don't have parking at home. And there's a lot of ideas about how to solve that with workplace charging, urban fast charging. So Tesla has both the intercity superchargers, which go at a higher rate, and the urban superchargers for their residents around Boston to be like Back Bay, Beacon Hill, people who have cars but don't necessarily have a place to charge them at home. So they can pop into the Prudential Center once a week, do some shopping, and charge up in an hour. Those are lower powered superchargers at like 72 kilowatts. So we don't see a lot of that yet, but I think we might see more of that kind of mid-power, urban, high-speed charging at grocery stores, things like that, for those who don't have access to home charging being their main source of power.
Thank you. So jumping into that topic a little bit, the multi-family dwelling units, what do you find as the most common misconceptions from normal consumers regarding EVs and EV charging, and also from MUD owners and managers, managers and owners of apartment complexes, condos, etc.? Do you see them as the same misconceptions and questions, or is there some variation there? Start with Cory.
So to answer the first part of your question, I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I'll start with an anecdote. When I leased my first EV a few years ago, and I shared the news with my mother very joyously about this new amazing purchase I had made, her first response to me was, "You're not going to have anywhere to charge. You're going to run out of gas." And I'm sure that's a very common response out there from consumers. And certainly that discussion about having more charging deployed, and range anxiety has been an ongoing topic for quite a while in many places. But I would just say, that misconception or her perception really does point to this continued need for, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, consumer awareness, but also education about EVs and EV charging. And, I would just point to groups like Plug in America that have done such great work trying to spread that awareness and educate consumers. And I think also there's just generally this idea of education and awareness writ large, both on EVs and charging, is a little bit undervalued, and it's not understood as much or as widely as a shared responsibility from the stakeholder community writ large as much as we'd like to think it is. So certainly kudos to Plug in America for really doubling down on that level of work, because it's so important, and our customer support teams spend a lot of time on that too. That's maybe the consumer side. But to your question about MUDs and the property owners or the building managers, one of the issues that we see or we've learned in our work is that many times the property owner or the building manager seems to think that deploying charging at their MUD can happen on an ad hoc basis as a consumer is asking for it. They can just almost like plug and play, drop it in. And I think, as we know, it's very, very complex oftentimes to get chargers installed directly at MUDs. So I think the misconception there is that they think it can develop on an ad hoc basis and doesn't require as much pre-planning or proactive planning as they might initially assume. And I think they learn very quickly that there's a whole number of hurdles that can interfere with the charger getting deployed there. So certainly the need for more proactive, holistic planning at these locations is extremely important.
Do you also find that they really don't have a sense of the different options and need to, or not when they come to the topic, they're not quite ready to navigate the market?
Yeah, I mean, we, with customers writ large, right, we have to do a lot of coaching and education on the different options, right? I mean, Flow as a company has different products it offers: level 2 DC fast charging and even, residential chargers. So yeah, we have to kind of take them through that process, help them figure out what they need or what they think they need or what they think they want. And then you start to match that up against the realities of their location or their property. Is that really the right fit? Do we have to adapt based on barriers potentially with the property itself?
Thank you. Pete, what do you think?
Well, yeah, the major misconceptions from the EV buyers, from the non-EV drivers who are thinking about buying an EV, they underestimate how many public chargers are out there already. They overestimate how often they would need to use public charging, and they overestimate how much of a concern charging time would be. An actual experience with an EV is the way to overcome that. When we would have our ride and drives, and we'll have them again in September for Drive Electric Week, I always show the map of PlugShare chargers, as well as the map of Tesla chargers in my car. And the response from non-EV drivers almost unanimously, I had no idea there were so many out there. Because EV chargers don't have signs on 80-foot poles towering over the freeway. They don't have signs on the exit ramps showing you where the chargers are, the way gas stations do. They're not nearly as visible, so people who don't have EVs are unaware that they exist. Once you actually have an EV, you realize there's a lot more out there already. Yes, we need more, but there's already quite a bit out there that works for a lot of drivers. In terms of the multi-unit dwellings, there's a lot of ideas for solutions there, but I was living in a condo with a big flat roof, and my wife was on the condo board, and the property manager was fairly amenable, and the solar guys didn't even want to deal with a condo building. They had so much business with single-family homes. They're like, why would we go through the complexity of working with a condo? It's a challenging administrative approach. The different entities you have to deal with, all the condo owners and the property manager, and the fact that you're often trenching through concrete in the case of EV charging. So new construction is really a much a longer term but lower cost approach. But for retrofitting existing facilities, it's going to be a heavy lift, and there's a lot of great ideas out there on how to do it.
Thank you. And Ben, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, misconceptions I think from consumers is really just owning an EV is a fundamental shift in how we've been refueling vehicles for basically forever, since we've had ICE vehicles, and that takes adjustment and a learning curve. And I think there's just also we have early adopters, but then those who follow are going to get over this change in how we fuel vehicles. And I think the misconception there is that, look, it's actually easier and it's more convenient and cheaper to own and operate a zero emission vehicle. Not on the medium or the multi-unit dwelling side. I think my colleagues Cory and Pete are probably a lot closer to this than I am, but I think it's understanding that, look, if you have chargers installed in your property, that it can make it more valuable, it can attract more renters and make you more of an appealing place to live, especially when we're talking about moving away from ICE vehicles and more towards battery electrics and other zero emission vehicles. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think everyone with an EV knows the two most common questions you get is how long does it take to charge and how far does it go? And this was the case in Poland when I lived in Poland, and here everywhere you go is the same two questions. And with how long does it take to charge, I often said, I don't know, I don't really pay attention. I just plug in and unplug when I leave. But I also, my favorite response, which I should try to use more, is a few seconds. And then, then you get people confused and you'll say, well, it takes a few seconds to plug in, and then you do something else. You shop at the grocery store. Or I lived without home charging for almost 3 years at a condo association, which I might come back to that. But let's jump to the next topic, which is, with all of that in mind, what kind of features do you think incentives programs should require for EV charging solution providers? So sort of taking those questions and challenges into your mind, what are the features that you think incentives programs should be focused on for the EV charging companies and stations and network companies? We'll start with Pete.
Sure. I mentioned a bit of this before. We've had some principles for the consumer-friendly charging experience, and these have been adopted by NESCOM to a degree in their public procurement requirements. But things like open access, versatility of payment options, being able to use a credit card or a commonly available payment option like that. Signage really helps, especially to let the non-EV drivers know. And then uptime and reliability are really important. Now, nobody should ever be stranded because the one EV charger was down. So redundancy to have lots of different charges at that station really helps improve reliability, as well as prompt maintenance of that. And integration with navigation apps would also help people know before they plan on stopping there that there's so many chargers available or non-functional. And as well, anti-icing ordinances are really helpful.
Thanks. And move on to Cory, and I think he's going to include that the charging solution providers have to have 3-letter names, right? They have to have short 3-letter names. Otherwise, come on. No, more seriously, Cory, what?
Yeah. The consumers is what I was going to say. Yeah. Just jumping in off that, Zach, I'm going to really hone in on, I think it was the second to last item Pete touched on around reliability and uptime. And I actually was just extensively talking to many of Ben's colleagues at the Energy Commission about this topic. We've done some writing on this recently via some blog posts. So we could not agree more with requiring features or features that require uptime and reliability for publicly funded stations. This is just stating the obvious, right? But a broken charger doesn't do any good for a driver when they pull up to use it. And when we think about counting toward our deployment goals, or if we think about the California context specifically, the state has a requirement, or a goal, I should say, to deploy 250,000 public charging stations by 2025. And we would argue that if we hit that number in terms of quantity, the number of chargers in the ground, that's great. But if a number of those chargers are unreliable, can we really pat ourselves on the back as having achieved that goal? It's an underlying kind of quality metric of the health of our overall network. And so, I think Flow fervently believes in that if we are taking public dollars to put stations in the ground, whether it's federal, state, local, or even ratepayer dollars from utilities, that adhering to uptime requirements as a consumer protection measure is a very reasonable ask from governments at all levels. So I would just leave it at that. And Ben, I hope you're taking notes on that one.
I'm feverishly taking notes. Thanks, Cory. No, this is a great topic, and we've been hearing more about this reliability, and it's a new frontier of deploying public chargers, and so we have to have this feedback loop on how to do it better. And we basically have a robust EV market here in the state, and get a lot of that feedback, such as these topics like reliability. From a state perspective, I think interoperability is important, and that we have to continue to ensure. It kind of gets back to the 3 C's again: convenience. If an EV driver is going to pull up to a EV charging station, they want to make sure that their vehicle can plug into the charger and be able to charge, and not have to worry about with an adapter and that sort of thing. Also, we want to be able to have a flexible program that we are leveraging our state dollars, public dollars, with the private capital. So we want to have a program that's built around ensuring that we have a private-public partnership as we deploy these chargers. I think that's incredibly important. And equity. And we're doing extensive research and studying on the distribution and the deployment of these chargers. Are we making sure we are addressing access for certain populations within the state, and adjusting our programs accordingly to make sure that we're not leaving any population base behind as we deploy chargers.
Thank y'all. Yeah, we were gonna focus on this in a separate question, so I'll modify a bit. But I've noticed, when I moved here from Europe 3 years ago, there were a bunch of new charging stations nearby at places we went to anyway. So we were thrilled, and they were often multi-stations, like 4 to 8 chargers, and we were really happy about that. And in just the course of a few years, many of them have broken. And this is a major, I'm not going to name names, but it's a major network, a very major one. And it's very unfortunate because you're not sure if you're going to have access now some places because of the number of broken charging ports. So you've all talked about the importance of this. I guess the question is twofold. What do network owners need to do what's needed to make this a less common issue? Obviously, Flo can speak to this quite well, I think, because that's your business. But also, what should policymakers do? Like, what can they do to make this less of an issue, or to solve the issue as it is? What kind of specific requirements could be put into legislation? We'll start with Pete.
Sure. Well, in a procurement, you could have a bond that is forfeited if they fall below the uptime threshold. And then there's design elements to better harden stations against, being hit by snowplows in the Northeast or things like that. Like, know the patterns of plow in your parking lot so you don't get the guy plowing in your lot doesn't hit the chargers. Some things, unfortunately, are like vandalism is a pretty common cause of damage to EV chargers. And so I don't know what the best solution is there. Maybe just, that will decrease in time as they get more common. And people got to appreciate why they're useful. Yeah, I'm curious to hear more ideas. We don't have a lot on that.
Just out of curiosity, where do you see vandalism as an issue? Because I don't notice that in Florida. But
I remember it was a presentation from CARB, I believe, a couple of years ago, noting that was the most frequent cause of damage to their stations. I don't know if that's a current statistic or not. Briefly back to one of my other points I got asked about in the Q&A was, what's icing? Icing is internal combustion engine. So when an EV charger is blocked by a regular gas car, that's icing.
Thanks. Cory, what do you have to say on this topic?
So there's a couple things I can speak to in terms of the Flow business model. How do we address it and ensure high reliability? The first one comes down to just the composition of the hardware itself. What is it comprised of? Our chargers have aluminum components. Other chargers might have plastic. We like the aluminum because it makes the charger more physically durable. It can weather the extreme elements, whether it's heat, cold. We have some chargers in the Yukon that survived those winters that we're pretty proud of. And that certainly also, this is related to storms, whatnot as well. So there's like the robustness of the hardware itself. On kind of the operations side of the equation, we have our own internal data center that we use to monitor the health of our network. And so we kind of monitor how our chargers are behaving. And if we find irregularities in how they're behaving, or if we see that something goes offline, we have our own internal process to kind of quickly elevate issues and get the charger back up and running as quickly as possible. And there's kind of a tiered process on how we address that. We have to work with the site host, but we have really, really internalized this in all of our day-to-day operations because it's so important. And then to your second question, externally, what can be done? Pete touched on the same answer that we have started to talk about, which is if you're receiving public funding, which my understanding is, most providers are going to be accessing public funding to deploy stations, maybe not always, but certainly in a lot of cases, that building in uptime requirements or a reliability standard, as we like to call it, is kind of your hook, right? To kind of push the envelope from industry to keep chargers as reliable as possible. And so the thought would be, if you don't adhere to the requirement, like Pete touched on, then there's some kind of potential clawback mechanism on the funding. I mean, that's the real hook or hammer we see to kind of push the envelope with the industry writ large. Not to say it's the only idea, of course, but it's one that we've been focused on.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, this is a topic that's emerged recently, and when that's not going to go away as we deploy more and more chargers. But I think part of this, and we haven't really done much work around this aspect, but I think vandalism could be tied a little bit to the location and are these sites lit? Are they in a spot where even a driver might feel safe to plug in, say a late hour in the night or something like that? But if they're in a location, I mean, the gas stations, right, are well lit. There's sometimes somebody in the convenience store. You feel like you're safe when you're pulling up, and nobody's really actively vandalizing a gas station for those reasons. But EV chargers could be out in a dark parking lot and easily in a location where somebody can do something that you don't want to do to the EV charger. I think we've recently heard anecdotally that when a city has been dealing with some vandalism on a charger, I think folks probably are after some of the metals that might be inside, copper and so forth. So I think we got to think through this a little bit. And again, I think it's tying to the locations. Are they lit and that sort of thing? And are people, I would say, if people feel comfortable going to a charger at a late hour in the dark, maybe then it might be less probable of being a victim to theft and vandalism. And also, I don't know, maybe Cory and Pete could speak to this, but having retractable cords and sort of just the innovating of the EVSE itself could help prevent vandalism and be more resilient and more reliable.
Yeah, I was. Oh, go ahead, Pete.
I can just add I mostly use the Tesla network. I have 2 EVs, and I mostly use the Tesla. And their charging network, the reliability feature is having lots of chargers at each location. So that's a pretty simple way to deal with the random failures that high power hardware will have, is you have multiple ones. And so a procurement should have a minimum, probably more like 4. A lot of them have had 2 DC fast chargers per location. I think 4 is probably better going forward, not only to serve more EVs, but to decrease the chance that they'd be all non-functional.
Yeah, and I think a lot of cases it should be 6, but there's certain cases where 4 is the practical minimum for a spot. But I think 6 is sort of a good number to make. Then you have to have several broken, and then people would get the message, would find out pretty quickly. Oh, this area is just bad. They have a lot, but they're broken. But I was catching up on the chat, and there's an interesting one here. Maybe Flo maybe Cory can discuss a little bit without being too specific on competitors, but I'm curious as well. Someone said most of the EVSE manufacturers do not have a maintenance program. Can you give some insight how common it is in the market for companies to have a maintenance program?
It's a good question. It's hard for me to comment writ large about what our competitors are up to. I would say, so our service agreements, or that we call them service level agreements, that's certainly a common practice for us. We know our competitors are employing them, but there's kind of two veins to that conversation. It's just, do you have a maintenance agreement or a service level agreement? But then also, like, what's included in that package? And you can have different tiers, or a different amount of service provided, and it's all customized to the to what the site host wants, right? So I don't think it's uncommon at all, because I think we all want the chargers working and well maintained, and we're increasingly seeing from customers that they want to spend less time handling that stuff themselves, handling the operations and the maintenance of the charger. So we certainly see that increasing writ large, but it would be hard for me to comment to what extent with the industry.
All right, thank you. Well, I've got more questions, but we have a lot here. We have 22 in the Q&A just right now. So go ahead and start going through these listener viewer questions. From Samuel Kindle, I will approach my condo association tomorrow to ask that they install chargers for residents. Our parking area is open, uncovered. No individual access to chargers is available. How shall I try to convince the board to install chargers? Very good question. Very tough one. Cory, why don't you start us off? So.
Well, to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, if we're talking about no individual access, therefore it's a common area. I guess what I would do is kind of lay out the options, help them understand what are the different options they could choose from that could be a good fit. Not knowing what their perceptions are as it relates to EV charging and how hard or easy it's going to be to get those things installed. I think showing them a little bit of pre-work and pre-planning on here's what it could look like, and here's the benefits it's going to provide us as drivers is probably the most important starting point. You just got to start building that foundation of knowledge and talking them through what are the options, what are the potential costs, what's the pathway to get that done, and of course emphasizing those benefits to the drivers. Why does the driver need it? Why does the driver want it? I guess that would be my suggested starting point.
Pete and Ben, do you guys want? Pete, go ahead.
Sure. I would try to ask them, is there a plan to resurface the parking lot at some point in the future, and time the installation to that? You don't want to be digging up the parking lot just for this if there was a plan to resurface it in a couple of years. So aligning it could reduce costs quite a bit. And it would have to be a paid station if there's no assigned parking spots, which is my inference here. Then it would have to be a paid station so that other cars aren't blocking that spot, like a metered spot or something, so that people aren't blocking it when they don't need to.
Ben, do you want to chime in with something else?
I'll just say maybe start small. I don't know how many EV drivers live in your community, but it could be as simple as trying to get one charger installed, but at the same time wiring up the parking lot for it to be able to take on additional chargers as more folks adopt EVs, which will likely happen if you put one charger in there and people, it starts catching on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in this area, at least, one shared charger and in a community like that would be a huge draw for a lot of people who are looking for that. So especially more, but one will start getting attention. Pete, what did you?
Yeah, where it's only a couple of EV drivers, the common access level 1 outlets or 120 volt outlets can work to a degree. I was at a meeting of a municipal utility in Concord, Mass, where a woman described doing just that. She plugged into the common area outlet, figured out she used about $20 a month of electricity, and paid the condo board $25 a month, just to be conservative about it. And it was no sub-metering, no fancy equipment, no contracts, just a good faith, low-tech solution in the near term using just level 1 and existing common outlet. So there are some options like that, but going forward, you will need actual chargers installed.
So I think across the board, I'm sort of hearing pay attention to who's on this board, who they are, what they're open to, and just do what you can to get the foot in the door. Moving on to the next one, can you talk a little about policy requirements for the equitable deployment of zero-emission vehicles and charging infrastructure across socioeconomic lines? Maybe start with Ben. I know this is a big topic in California.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for raising that. We're just getting into this, and we've got a report. If folks want to take a look, it's a wonky name, SB 1000 report. You can Google the Energy Commission and type in SB 1000. It'll come up. And we took a first initial look at, okay, where are we putting chargers across the state? And sure enough, they're concentrated in densely populated areas of the state. So how do we make adjustments to ensure that we're covering rural parts and those who are living in multi-unit dwellings? So we're in the early stages of trying to make tweaks to our programs to ensure that we're covering gaps around the state, but some basic requirements from policy perspective is obviously committing a certain amount of funding for equitable distribution, providing greater incentives for EV charging companies to put a charger at an MUD or near an MUD, and just using the carrot, if you will, to incentivize this activity. There's a lot of work to be done here. There's a lot of attention being looked at and cared for equity. It's just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at folks who are impacted by diesel particulate matter emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles, those who are on the lower spectrum of the income brackets are most impacted, and Blacks, Asian Americans, and Hispanics in California are also at greater risk of being exposed to diesel particulates than anybody else in the state. So it's a going to clean transportation, zero emissions is an equitable solution in itself, and we just need to make sure that we have chargers close to that these population bases have access to, and that's what we're looking at now.
Pete or Cory, do either of you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think Ben made some good points there. Diesel buses, electrifying those offers really substantial improvements in air quality. If you're looking at trying to get new EVs into the hands of low-market people, you have to consider what their alternative purchase would be. So it's not necessarily a cost-saving measure at 2021 to get a new EV, but used EVs can be a great solution, as well as new EVs for ride-sharing purposes. And actually we'll have a webinar on Friday talking about a low-interest loan program we piloted in Seattle with a community development financial institution to get EVs into LMI hands when they are the good economic option, which isn't always the case. So short version, we don't want to co-opt local people into paying more than they need to for transportation just to solve our optics problem. We want it to actually be the best choice for them. And there are some use cases where that works.
I would just jump in and add to build on Ben's point about equitable distribution of chargers. I think we need to add on to that thinking and also think about the accessible reliability of chargers. So not just are they evenly distributed throughout, a state or a country or whatever location you want to pick, but are they also being equitably serviced and maintained, and are they equitably reliable between networks or between sites or locations, whatever you want your geographic comparison to be. I think that's another really, really important consideration to build into this conversation. And then I would also just add that separate from kind of guaranteeing a minimum amount of incentives or infrastructure, whether it's vehicles or chargers going to being distributed evenly or broadly, or making sure underserved communities access it. We also maybe need to further broaden that thinking and think about just services in general. So it's not just about vehicle ownership or a charging station being deployed in a community, but there's alternative modes of transportation or business models to provide underserved communities access to, such as car sharing, van pooling. When you think about transportation network companies going zero emission, those are all different types of services or business models that can provide any number of communities with access to zero emission technologies.
Thank you. We've got an interesting one here. Are there going to be additional policies to support EV charging at home? Is anyone aware of any coming policies to support home EV charging? And there's a second question from the same person. Will there be any support for vehicle to grid integration as well? We'll start with Pete.
Sure. And in both these regards, I see utility programs as being more prevalent than state or federal policy. So various utilities have put forth plans to encourage off-peak charging at home through a variety of different measures. And it could be time of use rates, it could be a smart charger that interacts with the grid in some way. And this is using the least cost version of vehicle grid integration, which is managing load, shifting that load to off-peak. Not necessarily two-way power flow, but just taking power from the grid at the right time when it's least cost. I want to see a greater focus on ensuring that it's also least pollution. Simply going off-peak does not necessarily mean you're getting the least pollutant electricity. I see greater focus on that, but I do think utilities are making a real effort at encouraging off-peak charging.
Cory?
So it's hard for me to comment on the US as a whole and who might be doing more around residential charging, but thinking about California for a second, there is a lot of conversations happening around directing incentives toward panel upgrades of older homes that can't handle an EV load. And I know Southern California Edison, one of our utilities that covers Southern California, or a huge part of it at least, they're planning to put dollars into a program to help with panel upgrades in low income and disadvantaged communities. And so I think there's a lot of conversations emanating out from that to talk to the other utilities about doing that as well. And I also know that one of the vehicle incentive programs at the Air Resources Board, we call it Clean Cars for All. It's an incentive program for disadvantaged communities to purchase an EV. They also offer an incentive for panel upgrades. So maybe that doesn't directly pay for a charger, let's say, going into the home, but it's getting the home ready and overcoming another aspect of a financial barrier to getting a charger at a home in a low income household. So that's a really big one.
Cool. We have a lot of questions, so we'll try to have maybe one or two answers for each, and if anyone is like there's something really important you think is missing, chime in. Just a follow up on this one that someone asked on the side. How do you see the role of cities as compared to utilities as it relates to ongoing provision of EV charging stations, especially fast charging? How do you see them as continuing as providers, bridging the gap until the market matures? Do you see that as a key player that needs to be more involved? Maybe start with Ben.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, we're seeing a trend in California where I'll just say, yeah, absolutely, the local cities need to be involved. There's no question. But the trend that we're seeing is more cities are adopting local ordinances to require that new buildings, whether they be residential or commercial, are pre-wired to have EV chargers installed at some future date. So I think that's a huge role that they can play, and that's one of the stronger requirements to incentivize or to accelerate EV adoption. The other is permitting. We've been headed down this path for a while now in California to try to streamline permitting for EV charger installations, and it's been a long journey, but we're getting closer to accelerating the time it takes for a local municipality to approve permits for these installations.
Thanks. Pete, did you want to add something there?
Yeah. I've heard a lot of municipalities have interest in public level 2 charging, where they have municipal parking lots, having people spend a couple hours in their downtown, more so than DC fast charging, because also it's lower capital cost, works with the dwell time they're looking for, and it's still more in the wheelhouse of parking lots. But permitting is really important, and we're looking forward to a number of processes on that front.
Cool. I'll jump to, this is one that we haven't exactly talked about. So we are a condo with 93 units, and we're ready to pursue installation of EV charging stations in our common parking garage. So there's no one to convince. What are the most important factors to consider? Start with Cory there.
I think, first things first is, how many chargers are you trying to deploy, and what is the, is there any electrical access to that parking area? If so, what is its capacity? Because those are going to be your immediate potential cost barriers, or that will severely affect how many chargers can you deploy, how much is it going to cost. I mean, Pete touched on earlier this idea of having to tear up concrete. That's one of the most costly aspects of getting chargers installed like that. Do you have to rip up the entire floor of the parking area? Is it just parts of it? And thus how many chargers and thus wiring do you have to install? So those are going to be the most critical basic questions you're going to have to work through that will ultimately determine the costs of the project.
Is that good? Okay. Thought someone else might chime in there, but we'll have large portions of people live in apartments and condos where they can't charge at home, as we've been discussing at length. What would you recommend for them? So I think the question is, what would you recommend aside from everything we've already been talking about trying to get them to install chargers there? Let Cory. Yep.
Actually jump in on this one. I have not to monopolize, but I think this is something that Flo's done a lot of thinking on and cares a lot about, is if you're struggling to get charging at your condo or your MUD, we think, I'll put in quotations, elegant, certainly never simple, solution is nearby curbside charging. So we have a charging application that we integrate with street lamps, for instance, and we harness the excess energy off of LED bulbs, and it allows for a much faster, cheaper deployment that you can have for on-street parking. And we think that's going to be a really, really important alternative to charging for people that are struggling to get it directly at MUDs or common parking lots. And to kind of further connect this to a question from a second ago, this is going to be a really important role of cities as well, is helping identify those locations that are really suitable for curbside charging deployment.
Cool. We've got one here about the EV charging stations are clear to have an impact on the grid. And this is a common question about the grid impact of EV charging stations. What needs to be done to deal with impact on the grid? Anyone is free? Maybe Ben. I thought Ben might unmute first. There you go.
Yeah, I'll jump in quick because this is a good one. I'm sure others have ideas. The vehicle grid integration is something that we are very much looking into, and that means being able to put power back into the grid from the battery, or use your vehicle to power a building or some other structure that can take the power. This is important. We need to get OEMs on board. There's a lot of standardization that needs to take place and innovation to happen before it's widespread. But the idea is to be able to use, say you charge your car during periods of the day where there's a lot of renewables, and maybe you can use the charge in your vehicle to offset peak demand. That would be at a time later in the day when everybody's turning on their ACs or their heaters, or they're at home using their appliances to and you can use your car to maybe offset some of that energy. We're testing this out with school buses. We deployed school buses. They're a great application because they sit during the middle of the day, and they're it can charge when there's a lot of renewables, and then be able to help school districts put some of that power back into their complexes, their schools later in the day. So we're doing a lot of research on this and hope to share that with everyone once we get to that right point.
Cory or Pete, do you want to add anything on that topic?
Not much more to add from my side. I think Ben covered it really well.
And I think one key thing which smart chargers have is the ability to schedule charging at different times, and it can be quite easy to have policies that incentivize that. But yeah, well, that's an hour. We have a lot of good questions still there, but sorry, we've got a lot covered already. A lot of the questions are coming back to topics we've discussed, so I think we've been pretty thorough. Thank you to everyone. Cory, Ben, Pete somehow just disappeared a second ago. Maybe he had a hard deadline or something. Squirrel ate his wires. But thank you to everyone who joined, everyone who listened and provided input or questions. Appreciate it. Any final words from Cory, Ben?
Just thanks so much
for having me.
Thank you all.